Hi everyone, this is Morgan Berry. I teach photography and foundations here at UW Stout, and in this video I'm going to walk through the basics of photographing 2D images with a smartphone or simple DSLR camera and available or ambient light. So as an image to show as an example, I've picked this album cover largely because it's really colorful, so we'll know if we get the colors right or wrong, and also because it's glossy, which is going to make it trickier to photograph. This should make it a good problem-solving example for those of you working with any kind of reflective paint or reflective material. This is the room I chose to photograph in. There are a few reasons. One is it's my home studio, so it's easy. Another is I have a display board in here, so I can show you what the process looks like using that. And two, I have two different light sources on either side of the room, which is great. We're aiming for even light. Another thing I want to note about this space is I chose to photograph in here during a time of day when the sun wasn't coming directly into either one of these windows. The reason I liked that is I'm hoping to use diffused light. Diffused in this case just means that light is not coming directly into the window. It has to go through my blinds. It becomes a little bit softer and less harsh. I like this image as an example just because it shows the direct light from the sun and a cloud softens it. The main way you can tell this is if shadows are scattered, if the shadow edges are softer. That's a good guess that you are using a diffused light source. If you feel like your light source is too direct or too harsh, you can always use a thin piece of fabric, especially a light colored fabric, to block out windows to make the light coming through softer. Or wax paper can also do the trick. Any kind of light material that the light has to pass through will diffuse it. So once you've found a good space and/or a good DIY solution, the next thing you want to do is figure out where you will place your artwork to be photographed. I'm going to start with the most maybe obvious seeming solution given my particular space and put my image up on the pinup board. How I did this is using a camera and tripod, which you can use if you have one, obviously, but if you're shooting with a smartphone, the important thing is just to keep your camera parallel to the wall and also to remember where your camera lens is. Obviously, most are at the top of the smartphone, and that should be placed about halfway up your piece if you're photographing on a wall. I want to talk about why our result was this, which is an image with lots of problems, the biggest of which is we have a lot of glare coming right off of this piece. So a major way to understand what went wrong here is to consider this principle of light, which is that the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. Now, that sounds a little obtuse. What that means with us when we're working with photography is that whatever angle light travels at to encounter your work of art, that's the angle that it will reflect back off of it. So here we can pretty clearly see what went wrong. When I was standing in front of the display board to photograph this piece of art, light was traveling in that, follows that blue arrow, so that's the angle of incidence, and it reflected back at exactly the same angle. That's the green or aqua angle of reflection. So I'm getting a ton of glare because light was shining directly back into the camera lens. In this video of me moving around as I get ready to photograph, you can pretty clearly see how my shadow actually begins to sort of solve part of the issue. I can block out some of the light so the reflection is softer, but it doesn't completely solve the entire issue. Another thing I'm really struggling with about this image is how it's much brighter on the right side and much darker on the left. If you're remembering, one of the main things we're hoping for is even lighting. So strange as it might sound, my next approach was to photograph this piece on the ground. This is often the best solution for people photographing work in their homes or dorm rooms. One of the reasons this often works well is light is often more diffused on the ground just because it's normally a dimmer, less brightly lit part of any space. Another thing that I really like about this is that whole angle of incidence, angle of reflection thing won't be as likely to work against us here. So even though my setup is much different, you'll see that I'm still trying to keep my camera parallel to the work of art, which is now in the ground. I'm also trying to have the lens be right about in the center of the piece, so not a little bit in front of it or behind it. This is what that image looks like. So we're already much closer. It might be a tiny bit brighter on the right-hand side, but these are, minor issues compared to what we were just dealing with. So I want to explain why this worked out really well, and I'm going to show you another path of light illustration here. So again, the blue arrows represent the angle of incidence. The aqua arrows represent the angle of reflection. So both of those aqua arrows are pointing away from our camera, so we're not getting that nasty glare effect. You will also notice that I photographed this image with a bit of a border, so you can see some of the floor behind the image. I did that intentionally so it would be easier to crop down. Just with the way cameras control perspective, if you have something dead center with a little bit of a border around the piece, cropping later on will be easy, and you can see I have a nice crisp image just after a very quick tour into Photoshop. The danger of photographing too closely or too tightly initially is that sometimes your image will be a little bit warped, and that will make creating straight lines later on during editing really tough. So this is the easier route. So just to review, once you've picked your location, you assess the light that you have available, decide if you need to modify it, choose where you're going to place your art for the least reflections, and then just do what is in many ways the easiest of all the steps and shoot parallel to the subject. So if you've made it to the end of this actual process, congratulations, it is not as easy as it looks. Thanks, everyone.